Bom dia a todas e a todos. Good morning for the people who will follow the seminar in English. There will be a simultaneous translation into English. I'm going to speak, of course, in Portuguese. We are here in Brasília, the Brazil's capital. And now, em português, bom dia a todas e todos.
Bom dia. Good morning, everybody who's here present or who's watching us online. And it is a pleasure for Congresso em Foco to do this project. And in the end of the year, it's such a hard moment to do such a project. And I thank all the speakers who came here. I thank Google, who's sponsoring, and I thank you who's watching. If you can share and help everybody, because this is a very important discussion, not only for the future of journalism, but for the future of democracy, because without a quality journalism, without people having access to such quality journalism, it's impossible to have a society who can have decisions by themselves. I am Silvio Costa, the founder of Congresso em Foco, and our role here is not an idea of showing a way or showing the right path. It's just opening the space for a democratic and plural discussion where everybody has a voice and has the possibility to give their ideas, because we are here always discussing regulations of platforms and all issues related to journalism, because we are trying to keep the idea that we want to show the Congress and all the people that we can discuss the ideas that are going to be put in practice by the Congress, by the executive power, and a little bit by the judicial power as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask for this first table, Kátia Brandati, the president of the Brazilian Society of Investigative Journalism. I also want to ask João Brant, the secretary of digital politics of the educational secretariat of the presidency. And I want to ask the coordinator of Atlas da Notícia, who's a person who's been indicating a lot of interesting possibilities to think about journalism and to think about all the different possibilities that this digital world gives us, because there's a lot of scary things, but there's also a lot of new opportunities. And using this little bit of space, I ask the men to allow me to ask Kátia Brandati to start our conversation. As I said before, each speaker will have 10 minutes for their speech, and then after we're going to open up for questions. Kátia, please. Hello. Good morning, everybody. I would like firstly to thank a lot for this invitation, because this is something we need to do. We need to discuss where journalism is and where it's going. It feels like we're discussing this a lot and repetitively, but until we find a solution, this is something we need to discuss. So, as I was introduced, I am the president of Abrate. I was a professor in the University of Curitiba, and I also work in the newspaper Estadão. And I have been dealing with journalism for over 20 years, which is the times I have in a career. I am the feminine voice in this table here, and I want to say that us women are suffering more than men. I think that's something that needs to be pointed out in the discussion about paths and diagnostics. And when I saw all the discussions, I was thankful to be put in the one with diagnostics, because I feel like saying that how the situation is something that I can do is easier. And the situation is very bad. Well, without measuring my words, we are living a very hard moment in a lot of ways. And the concept of what is journalism and the everyday life and the interviews to all the people who are working, doing all the financial sustainability and how to maintain such a business, because most of us are related to the businesses who are trying to find their way to sustain, how to keep going. And people ask, what's the difference between investigative journalism to normal journalism? People think that we're casters isolated from society, and it's not like that. But one of the main factors that makes investigative journalism different is that investigative journalism is more expensive, and it is made formed by people who are more experienced, and that it has a cost that is a little bit higher. So if maintaining journalism is hard, maintaining investigative journalism is harder, because it requires a bigger cost and requires a harder work, because the consequences of anything that goes wrong can be much bigger. And here, seeing that Google is one of our people, our sponsors here, I need to say that we have to do a diagnosis of the system to consider what is journalism and what is not. We have always avoided this discussion because we have to think about what is journalism. We have a lot of these discussions, and the fact that we're discussing so much puts us in even a bigger, more concerning concept, because the world has changed in the last 20 years, and the way that we do communication in general has changed, and we haven't had a moment to stop and talk about what is this journalism and what is the difference between journalism and non-journalism. And that is when we have the moment of misinformation coming in, mostly from people who are saying they are journalists, but they're not really. And until we face this discussion of what is journalism and what is not, we're going to keep going in circles with some very concerning consequences. I'm going to talk here with the obvious reasons of judicial consequences, because this has been hard. The concept of condemning journalists and people who say or journalists or not. For example, on January 8th, we have a lot of people who said they were journalists and who are people who are now either arrested or going through trial, and they are trying to seek shelter in organizations for free speech, of organizations for journalism, because they say what they did, it was journalism, but that is not. And we need to see and face that, because until we do, we will face these consequences. In a lot of recent conversations, we have talked about the idea of protecting our fonts, and we're talking about a very important matter, that is protecting those people, not protecting the journalists themselves, but those people who wouldn't speak because they would be scared of consequences. But who are the people who have access to this type of agreement? Journalists. However, in the legal basis, we have a lot of processes coming from people who are not journalists, and they are allegedly trying to seek this protection. But how is the judicial power supposed to know who are those people, who are actual journalists, or who are the people who are just trying to protect somebody who should come forward and say that, well, they paid for something very important to happen. They should come forward and give away all this information. We have also discussed in the judicial power the idea of the impact of protecting people who are being interviewed. We don't know if the consequences are actually that big, because the press is theoretically already responsible for what they publish. For example, we have talked a lot about the case of Roberto Jefferson, talking about money that was coming for all the political parties, but only the person who was saying that had the responsibility for that. The press who was publishing this had to decide the journalistic relevance, but couldn't really go forward with the funds. However, when we're talking about these processes in journalism, we forget to talk about the end, to talk about the person in a small town who goes to a communication device to say that a policeman came and invaded their house, for example, or did some kind of violence, and the press cannot check if that really happened. That person is saying that, but we cannot disconsider these people, because we will make a lot of information that is very important and that is very relevant, just invisible. So to finalize what I was saying is, our situation right now is a problem. Oh, she said still have 5 minutes, but I'm going to end here anyway, and we're going to give more time for questions. So our diagnostics is, the situation right now is a problem. We have no way of going back to a world without social media, in which the press had a monopoly of the collective discourse. But we need to deal with the situation in an adult way, and not really hiding the problem, but really facing it. Thank you very much. You're going to have an opportunity to talk more.
Need more time for the debate, so I would like to thank especially Natalia Mazoch and all the other people from Google who contributed to realize, I know that the way the world is made with organizations, but also with people, and I had a very pleasant experience with Google, especially with journalists that have a very similar way of seeing the world as we do, and following democracy. Thank you for your presence, Natalia. And Secretary of Digital Politics. Thank you, Macau. Someone sensational for the organization. It was all very fast, very difficult. It was a challenge, but thank God it's all working. We've been told there's more than 1,000 people following online, which is very impressive for this time of the day and this density, which shows the interest of people. Secretary, you have the word. Thank you, Silvio. Thank you, Kátia. Sérgio, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I would like to introduce saying that the Secretary was created during the transition of the government for the comprehension of the new government that we needed a place. So we are as SECOM with this. We articulate with other ministries, but we look especially at these questions that we are debating here to, again, the fight against miscommunication and hate discourse and strengthening journalism. I think we need to consider initially.
Temos problema, né? Acho que a Kátia já botou o sarrafo lá em cima, dizendo temos e é grave.
Yeah.
Acho que
it is complicated. This is also our evaluation. Our point of view is two questions. One is an economical and a change that is mediators of the relationship of the users with content. There are studies showing that digital publicity is today maintained and controlled by big companies, especially Google and Meta, and how the evolution of that and element of sustainability for journalism, it could be positive for some positive initiatives, as some of the people here. Macau seems happy today for a different reason, but I think we have a condition that we need to make the diagnosis more profound. With the dialogue that we have with the companies, we had the opportunity to speak with Google, and Google talks about the contribution of the divulgation of content, but these numbers need to appear. We need to see them. Needs to be transparency. Vehicles need to have a reading of these. Apologies. Otherwise, we speak of a process that is only from one of the parts, and this is the dimension of how the platforms contribute or appropriate, especially in a very short time of humanity, that was available. But the debate will always be in versions, but not necessarily in facts. And I think that we need to make the diagnosis more profound in facts. Second point is the logic of access and distribution. What is how the Brazilians appropriate and reach the information. We have some researches. Reuters is a reference that shows how social media are more used for news, not only content, and that creates a problem from our point of view. because one of the problems of the platform model is maximizing engagement and not criteria of professional journalism that has always, not always, but in this period, have were majority in the distribution of information. So these two factors combined create a very significant problem for us. And what is the government with this? This is a question that we put to ourselves. It's not completely answered, but I think the way is, if I resume, yes, the government has a mission on that, which is to support the sustainability of journalism or the impact that it has on democracy, which I will reference Silvio. Our reading is very similar. Freedom of speech has a very evident expression, but there is a different one, a dark side of, which is the collective society being well informed for their decisions. And that depends on trustful information. So Brazil has engaged in integrity of information. What do we mean by that? There is the consistent, reliable information so that society can take their decisions day to day. These terms have been used from ONU that organizes a code. UNESCO is close, showing guidelines for platforms, and it seems Brazil had the opportunity to advance in some ways in accord with Germany to work on that agenda. And today, President Lula has announced a declaration from Mercosul applied for this agenda. That allows us to think also the global and regional and bring solutions closer as to other countries are. In a concrete way, we are already working on that agenda, first with Project 2630. This theme was very strong. What we understand today is that it's needed to improve the text, so it's amplifying pluralism and diversity in its effects. We understand the text as it is could reproduce monopoly and concentration, which is not to abandon it. It's recognizing the advances of the text, but bring other elements for the public discussion. I think the contributions from Fenagia, Jor, and other actors, they illuminate this way and help us to find solutions. That helps to fight the problem we talked in the beginning, which is understanding how these mechanisms also maintain incentives for the actions directly from the companies so that they don't work as a counter incentive, as we saw in the accords in Canada. The accords with Google show the complexity of the process. If you want to make do with there is a possibility of abuses in the case of Meta removing online contents. To finish it, there are measures we want to take immediately to bring to public. We are discussing with Minister Pimenta. He knows that for it to advance, we need to get to accords within the civil society, relationships with platforms. We have an agenda about publicity that amplifies the capacity of the government to invest in digital publicity. We need to recognize that it has a primary There's an externally that could be positive or negative to strengthen specific actors in the market. So we need to bring that element to the conversation without inverting the order of priorities in the story. We have also a dimension in the beginning of the year that sustainability needs to be thought more of how the platforms will contribute. But there are also mechanisms that are BNDES in different funds, and to answer questions that have to do with the market in publicity, digital publicity, and also to responding. President Lula has signed a decree to strengthen a communication that is anti-racism, and how we strengthen vehicles from Black people. I am giving a general articulation, but it is fundamental so we can advance. Also, that theme is on G20 for the first time with our leadership, and we have a strong interest to dialogue. Thank you. The Secretary.
Nessa primeira mesa a gente está tratando do diagnóstico, né? Você ouviu agora o secretário de Políticas Digitais da Secretaria de Comunicação da Presidência da
You
República.
just heard the Secretary of the President of the Secretariat of Digital Politics, and now we're going to hear another 10-minute presentation. I'm going to ask the speaker to present himself. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you, with João and Katia. I am the chief editor of a coalition of 41 vehicles of communication that fight disinformation, misinformation. And in Abrage, I also coordinate the area of courses, and this year we had a course for independent journalism that had over 3,000 subscriptions. I am the president of Projo that coordinates the press observation, and I also coordinate Atlas da Notícia, which is an annual census to map the presence of local journalism in Brazil. Well, since the idea is to talk about diagnosis, I brought a few numbers. That is the result of one of the census that I had to have a base for this diagnosis. I'm going to see if I can put the slides on. Well, let me go back. I'm going to do it really fast, but here we had a reduction of 8.6% of the news deserts here in Brazil. And it's important because for the first time, the number of cities that have a vehicle of journalism is bigger than the ones that don't. But most cities don't have a one press that does local journalism, which is an important data. And this expansion that we detected this year is mostly because of the expansion of digital. And we had over 500 more digital-based press and other radio devices as well. Here we also have some community radios that do journalism or have some kind of journalistic cover. And these community radios are an interesting space to explore because we have a lot of them to occupy this very interesting space. So we have been seeing how journalism has occupied our territory, and this news is not really that expressive because now we have digital journalists occupying spaces that before were related to printed press. I'm going to go through all this data very quickly so you can see. You see that online journalism starts occupying this leading position, and there is no barriers to dealing with online journalism, which helps more vehicles to appear, but these organizations are also very hard to deal with because they're very precary. And I want to show you this data of the places that we consider almost deserts, which are the cities that have one or two different vehicles of journalism, which are places that could become deserts. And I think that this analysis that we do here is also important for other vehicles that are important even when it's not related to these deserts. But we're talking here about cities that go from 12 inhabitants to 120,000 inhabitants. Well, 28% of these businesses never had any planning. Only 33% of these 36% do the work full time. And this is the important data. 100% of these, they publish news, and 97% cover local news. So these are businesses that have very important impact on the location where they are. So it is important to preserve these different businesses. Well, 68% of them have over 25% of profit, 25,000 reais of profit. And we also always talk about good journalism being expensive, and that is true. But when we talk about this number, we see that they can do journalism with little resources. So sometimes we see that you don't need that much to give survival to these organizations. We're not talking about organizations that have a lot of resources to do and to do their work. So some of these organizations, they depend solely on publicity and have 95% of their revenue linked to that. And when we have this graph, we see how important publicity and advertisement is here, because a lot of the organizations don't have the ways to seek other types of revenue. 26% of them have at least one person dedicated to commercial area, and 7% of them are related to the editorial businesses. So over 45% of these businesses have only one person dealing with the content. 22% do publish their editorials and the website. 61% do not publish their expedient. And here in a general overview, you see that you have an excess of work and little payment, a high dependence of social media to create an audience in a moment that social media does not relate to bringing these people to the website right now. And you see that managing is very informal. You can also see that a lot of them have a hard time creating more revenue for them. And most 26% do not know where their audience comes from, which is very worrying. But now we can talk about the paths for sustainable journalism, and I'm going to suggest 4 paths. First, the definition and advertising of the purpose and the editorial compromises, and that is very important because that also creates a link with the audience, because now the audience can seek to actually ask for what they are getting or they're supposed to get. You also have the capacitation for management, because a lot of them do not have access to good management. We have the diversity or income, because a lot of them are basically depending solely on advertisement. And we also have the creation of public and private funds for journalism. You see that it is a shame for a city that does not have a journalistic way of publishing their local news. So with that, I'll just finish my speech. Thank you.
Muito bom, Sérgio. Poxa, estou recebendo aqui um retorno tão positivo aqui sobre as intervenções de vocês aqui, muita gente aqui mandando mensagem aqui pelo WhatsApp aqui, demonstrando muito interesse.
I want to thank everybody who is getting interested, and I'm going to open now for the public.
I would like
We're going to ask questions.
Since our table is diagnosis, but since we are informally discussing, since Sergio brought this vision of possible paths, which from our event, if I understood well, talks about fundamental things that a journalistic organization needs to have: transparency, competent administration, and diversity of sources, and speaks about the necessity of creating funds, public and private. I can't lose this opportunity having the secretary here in front of this discussion in a technical way inside the federal government. I would like to have your opinions about that as well, but I would start asking while the audience doesn't have questions. We will hear a colleague journalist, but briefly, what is possible in this theme of private and public funding, considering the necessity of financing good journalism, and in other way, the necessity of taking care of state intervention that is not abusive and eventually has a censor characteristic. Please, Secretary, and then Katia and Sergio. Then we will hear questions from the audience. I think this question resumes the challenges from the table at this way, that we need to have conditions to advance from new formulations first. When I defend the state has a part, it doesn't mean it's always positive. there's a possibility of a negative and distortive way on this market, but also an appropriation, political appropriation of fomenting. It is forbidden to create funds for themes that could be created within the. It does not mean that we can't create mechanisms close to funding, logics that you establish. You have to understand how SENAGE, for example, has SIG contribution for economy. We could read all the scenarios where these resources could come and direct strengthening journalism from public interest. When we talk about journalism of public interest, you could have 50 hands asking, what do you mean by that? And I think Sergio, in conversations previously, talked about that being a preoccupation from the vehicles to establish criteria. Katia has spoken about that differentiation, that it's important. We need that courage to understand what is journalism of public interest and what is only political militants disguised as journalism. We can't bring it to a logic of separation within professional and militant journalism, but professional journalism not following criteria that should substance journalism, and militant journalism doing all of the careful of representing selections of agendas and points of view from both sides, almost more professional than the professionals. I don't want to heat up the Twitter conversations, but I think this debate needs to happen in its complexity so that we don't only keep labels that won't be helpful. I think there is a path for that. And the idea of private funding, we're studying it, but I look at it anyway. The sector needs to say if they need a logic of private funding. There is auto-org and patrimonial funding. There's a bigger challenge. From the government, we don't create taxes for private funding, so it has to go to a logic. The government will have to create the brakes and counters so that it doesn't create political incidency. Katia? Thank you, Silvio. I think that we need to fight with what is journalism, what isn't, and also the financial question. We don't have a question that most journalism don't have domain of administration or are dependent of a model of one only source, and we know that the source is drying out. All of the studies show this migration of publicity, for example. When I think of the private public funding, it seems, I will compare, it might not be the most adequate, but we have a conclusion that Brazilians have debts, and there is a program, a project, so that people will pay their debts. We can't keep talking about journalism that can't sustain itself without creating a similar program, not only for debts, but also perspectives of the future, not only to pay monthly bills, but to structure from now on, in whatever format that is, private or public, a combination of both, more grants, more microcredits. Sometimes this microcredit has a huge effect. We'll have to face that question about creating these programs for journalism. I will advance something that we have been talking about. Something that we talk about data or News Pro Atlas, trying to resolve this problem, differentiating these indicators for journalistic organizations that could demonstrate some kind of compromise with journalism and with audience. These indicators create a seal of approval that could help with these distinctions. What are these indicators? And I said a compromise with transparency, but for example, publicity, presence of a policy of correction of errors, the editorials being published, and other indicators that will probably create a compromise that could be demanded from the audience and demanded from others. I think that could help to differentiate. About funding, when I talk about funding, I don't talk only about funding that are connected to the federal government. I think that we have to think about how the states and municipalities, our information in the world so charged with disinformation, the information needs to be seen as political. And if I don't offer to my citizens the possibility of accessing news about the place where they live, I can't be happy if I am a mayor, because the diversity needs to be in the sources for the good of journalism. A platform would be great if it's sustained only by publicity. They will cover publicly, great, but it will not cover the companies as well in a place where they live. So having organizations that are sustained by other ways will allow companies to be better demanded. So we talk little about that. Good information depends on that diversity of information vehicles created by the different sources of financing. Maybe that it's too difficult to talk about that, while there are many states that don't have any journalism, but the second phase is that many places already have conditions to work the diversity. Okay, now we're listening to a question from the audience. Please indicate who you want to answer your question. Actually, I'd like to place a question from a collective of the table. Because I would like to comment that I think this initiative of the event is very interesting, because this is not a dilemma that is only ours. It's international, it's worldwide. All the world is facing this with social media advancing. Secondly, I would like to place that one question that hasn't been talked about in this first debate, which is, who is a journalist today? The journalist today. Today is a journalist who thinks they are. There are a lot of people in social media exerting journalism and telling they are journalists with hate, discourse, and lies, manipulations. And who controls that? I think this is a point that we need to discuss, because as bad as the previous model was, the person to be a journalist had to go to college, study ethics code knew that if they lied, they had to fix the mistake the next day. And now it's land without law, an absurd thing. We've said that to the minister when Barroso, when we were there recently. An engineer, they have the obligations to answer to a council, and if a bridge falls on top of people, then this responsible will have to answer for it. A journalist, what does a journalist talk for? If we don't have a criteria to say who is a journalist and what can be done, we need to have a council like the lawyers do. And that it will not be this absurd thing that is nowadays. I would like to talk at this point to our conversation is that what we want, broken land. I have been the president of syndicates for several times, have been my professional way talking about journalism and liberty of expression. And it is not liberty to give fake news. People who do that need to be demanded by society. And who does that, how that happens. This is what I would like to point out. Well, since we have a short time, I will ask another audience to add their intervention, and then we can close this first table. Good morning, everyone. I would like to congratulate Silvio and everyone who promoted this event. I am in the area of federal budgeting, and my question is based on the last comments. It is impressive, the expansion of means of information. I am in the public area for years, from a time that we didn't know what happened in the interiors of the country. Nowadays, we have news. I am happy to know that my cities, I can access the internet and see what is happening over there. But I have a question now. The data presented says we have more than 5,000 communication vehicles in the interiors. And the presidency, or who controls the news that gets to us, can we verify them, or are only news that those who claim to be journalists, as our friend has said? We know that the journalism has become a problem, and we don't know who is real and who is not. I'd like to know if the information that comes from these interiors, if there is any kind of control from the presidency of the Republic, so we can know what is the truth or not from the news published every day. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to pass the word to we have a lot of administrators from journalistic entities here. Please, Samira. Thank you, Silvio. Good morning, everyone. I am Samira de Castro. I'm in the presidency of federal journalism. A little more than 20 years persisting in this profession that I believe a lot. First, I'd like to congratulate the quality of this table. I think it's been very well pointed out all the Caucasians of the table, and I think the research that Sergio has brought have been great, so we can comprehend the size of the problem that we are facing, and we have a historic obligation to try and find solutions. Maybe my comments will be troubled. I think when we talk about these new arrangements, we know many of these vehicles don't have administration, because that hasn't been taught to us in universities how to administrate our business. But we have to think that before, although it was always a model of family business that many times didn't prime for sustainability. We'll give a very concrete data. In the formal market for journalists has shrunk 21% from the last 10 years. We have lost 21% of formal jobs. And what jobs have been created because of that? As far as I know, zero. So we need to effectively think of sustainability of journalism via funding, public or private initiatives of support, but we need to think about the place of creating jobs. We need to defend the professionals that my master has talked about, the formation, and we don't have laws for press. With the diploma, the Superior Tribunal thinks they can talk about the liberty of press, and the vehicle has a responsibility for what the interviewer will say. And that is we have got here for choices that haven't been made by the workers. Thank you. Okay, so we are racing against time. We have to close this table. So I would ask, starting from Sergio, to make final comments. Amanda has made a proposition about creating a council, and all the other punctuations from jobs and the questions of democracy and how we can place quality journalism to improve the quality of our democracy as well. Please, your final observations. Very complex theme. I think I will isolate and let Katia talk about the professionals, since she represents the entity that takes care of professional journalism. About the number of vehicles and the quality of what is produced, I think there are actually around 15,000. 5,000 are the digital vehicles. Our data does not consider the quality or type of content. We've isolated the vehicles that we understand that have a relationship with public locally. After the pandemic, they started using the space of journalism. That's something else very important for us to have in mind, because when population demanded services during the pandemic, in these places where you don't have good journalism, the City Hall started to occupy that space, and that is also troublesome. The local public powers that determine a specific political line placing themselves as this producers of information and news. I don't think it's possible for a research as ours to make that distinction between what's truthful content or not. I insist that editorials that could be demanded by the audience is the best way to have that kind of control. So the control from the audience. And we think that you've lost publicity and look for other sources of funding. There is also a compromise with all of these other actors in the scene. So if I live from a collective financing or working with subscriptions or some kind of payment from audience, I also have that audience demanding from me more. That's not a solution, because during the pandemic, another research that we had from Atlas, the demand was that the vehicles would take some kind of position about vaccines and treatments. There was a lot of pressure from the readers that the media vehicles would position themselves. And so that's a very difficult thing to do. And the criteria we could demand from the platform so they could be created. And something that involves business models and a very strong relationship with editorial principles. You can't think of business models in journalism without them bringing the editorial principles. They are part of the business model. You can't, when you think of sustainability, financial sustainability, you can't risk your compromising your editorial principles. I think these things, they communicate about the jobs lost. Many of them we see from Atlas because it demonstrates that these people that lost their jobs who have their own audience or their own social capital, they migrate to digital, creating their own initiatives. It's very easy. There is no obstacles. You can create it overnight. Sometimes you can do it from an emotional aspect. From time to time, you don't have your money anymore and you have to do other jobs to maintain it. So this occupation from digital, the problems are there. The impossibility of administration conducting these business. I think at this path of entrepreneurship is very good for journalism, because I always talk about the impressive solutions coming from digital universe. You don't find one is from traditional media who is there. There is a renewal for this production of news that is motivated by these people who are leaving these jobs, sometimes forcefully, where they couldn't care about all the rest, and now they start to be business people. But it's not easy. It's very difficult. They need to have some kind of training for that and create accords with other actors to bring that. But I think that the solution for journalism in Brazil is in digital and these vehicles that represent new audiences with other compromises with their audiences. I will try to be brief. All of the questions pointed here that we've discussed here, they create a cascade of effect. They go back into themselves and they also become greater. If we don't discuss funding, we'll only discuss more loss of jobs without having the alternative of entrepreneurship, because if you don't have a source of funding for small platforms, we only lose work. Since this is diagnostics table, the final provocation I have is let's identify, let's diagnose. This 21%, where have they gone to? They've changed professions, they've become business people. This hasn't been positive, or did it avoid a higher number of loss of jobs? The numbers show clearly that the vision is more clear when we base on data. And the data that he has bring are quantitatives. We are not talking about the quality of the information that gets to people, and we will have to face that. And I will go back to my initial point, which is we need to separate what is journalism, what isn't, so we can finance journalism. Because journalism is what fights disinformation and misinformation. But if we create a cascade of money, public or private, who will use that money? Today, if we don't make that distinction, we will mix everything up. And it's not so much about being a militant, but also about techniques. So we need to formally diagnose it and make the decisions that are needed. I think that what Armando has pointed out, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and your career is inspiring. I think it brings a problem that is not easily answered. If I tell you, yes, a diploma and a council, what kind of restriction that creates? We're talking about a lot of people, 1.8 million people in each one of these vehicles. And there is already a filter of what could be considered journalistic. So that answer is complex from a general way of thinking. But the reality of a lot of people is about influences, which most of the time are within an agenda of I have a mattress in the studio because I have to monetize 5 or 6 videos a day. So it isn't a romantic way of looking at this model. There is an arrangement as it is, strengthens a practice that this number will be lower if we don't do anything. And this is a problem from the point of view of journalism. So I think here we have a debate that is serious. And answering Afonso, the government doesn't have to control the vehicles that are around. What is the mission of the government? Not announcing vehicles that promote disinformation and illegal content. And we also respond to misinformation in public politics. For example, vaccines. We don't allow that disinformation. We have to promote quality journalism. That companies have more responsibility where they can profit from this information. There other responsibilities. For example, the expansion of public communications. This is done with federal universities and federal institutes. Yeah. That expansion allows local journalism with quality, because this network is that the institutes can create. We have articulations with different actors in civil society so that media education could happen in volume and scale all around the country. We had an event in October in 24 states, and that happens because of articulations with civil society and states. So I will not talk about the Superior Tribunal, what happened in 2009, have left. We know how many problems that law had, but the complete removal of this reference creates a vacuum that have been followed by decisions, as we have seen 2 weeks ago. Thank you for the invitation. We are here to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Bom, muito obrigado aos debatedores, muito obrigado a você pela audiência. A gente vai fazer um intervalo super curtinho, porque a gente estendeu um pouquinho essa primeira mesa em razão do interesse que ela despertou, né? Intervalo de 5 minutinhos apenas.
So we have a 5-minute break.
Na sua casa, no seu trabalho, pegar uma água, ir até o banheiro, ir até a cozinha, um cafezinho.
And we'll return in 5 minutes.
Com meu colega Edson Sardinha, diretor do Congresso Foco, que vai coordenar, e a participação, inclusive, de palestrantes internacionais que vão trazer a visão de como está esse debate que a gente fez aqui pelo mundo afora. Muito obrigado e até daqui a pouco.
You belong to me. How my poor heart aches with every step you take, every move you make, every bow
Olá, pessoal. Bom dia mais
Hello,
uma vez.
everybody. Good morning again. Thank you all for your presence. I am Edson Sardinha. I'm the director of rating here in Congresso and Foco, and we're going to continue with our second table now in this seminar, Paths to a Sustainable Journalism, made by Congresso and Foco and sponsored by Google. And we're going to discuss national and international proposals for the strengthening of journalism. We're going to have three people coming in online. Two of them are foreigners, so if you need any translation, we have the devices available for you. We're going to start now calling the representative of the Association of Digital Journalism, AJOR, Carla Egidio. Please be very welcome. We're also going to have the participation of the professor of the University of Ottawa in Canada, Michael Geist, and the media historian, Paul Matsoko, and the participation of Carol D'Artora, our congresswoman. And we all know that without journalism, there is no democracy. So we need to make communication sustainable and viable. And some proposals are going to be discussed. Well, they are discussed already, both in the government and some of them in the Congress. So we're going to start our discussion trying to understand how this discussion is being done inside the Congress with the Congresswoman Carol D'Artora from PT Paraná. Welcome and thank you for your participation. Congresswoman, do you hear us? Yes. Do you hear me? Yes, perfectly. So, the Congress discussed this year the possibility of financing digital platforms for journalism, but this discussion hasn't had an understanding or a solution. A lot of hard discussion along the big techs and the communication vehicles. So I would like to know, what can we expect of this discussion for the next year, and why why is it so hard to get to a solution? Well, first of all, I'd like to thank for the invitation to discuss about paths for sustainable journalism. I'm very happy. I am not a journalist. Communication is not a theme that I discussed throughout my academic formation, but communication is a human thing. The human being in itself has to learn to communicate, and I started dealing with that throughout my career as a professor, and I see more and more of it now in the Congress, discussing this new explosion of communication with the new technologies and all the challenges that are presented by this, a lot in politics as well. So throughout this time as a congresswoman, I tried to understand a little bit how people receive what we are trying to communicate, and what are the best ways for us to communicate. How can we do it in a healthier way, in a more teaching way? And we also need to understand how to think the communication in our country, because it has been suffering a lot of attacks especially thinking about the public policies to bring the communication as something that everybody has to have access to. So throughout my time as a congresswoman, I have been trying to learn a lot about all these themes. And now to start to reply to this question, it's funny because we had a meeting yesterday in the Congress to debate communication and talking about how fake news are still having such an impact and how the rights of authenticity are related to this. And we're having a lot of difficulties because, of course, there's a lot of lobbies from the big techs and from full political parties that are not, for example, for the regulation of medias, or the big techs that are not willing to pay what the smaller vehicles of communications are due. And even if we are talking about it right now, if we're talking about the whole communication system and this moment where the debates are doing such an impact everywhere, we still haven't had the way to get to a solution. So what I see now is that we need to advance in a social comprehension of regulation of medias in very important points. For example, guaranteeing the freedom of speech without creating the freedom to propagate the discussion of hate, the hate crimes that are being promoted around these discourses as said freedom of speech. So we are trying to do that. We're trying to protect journalism against censorship while trying to protect all these principles. Another thing that we think is a very important path to think of a sustainable journalism is fighting misinformation and fake news. So this regulation is trying to fight the whole propagation of misinformation and trying to create a safe space to propagate information, trying to protect the public from this type of fake news that are going around in all the medias that we see through WhatsApp, through social media, and that is something that needs to be seen by the public powers. We also have to think about ethics and social responsibility. So we need to establish the standards for this ethics and to guarantee this information will be propagated in an ethical way, in a diverse and representative way, so we can ins create incentives for different perspectives and voices to have space in this journalism, because then we can see the representation of the richness and the diversity of society. We also need to protect the regulations for the consumers, because we need the consumers to be safe from misunderstandings and misinformation that is propagated around. And it's very weird to see right now how people don't trust the journalistic institutions, because we see groups of propagations of misinformation in which this misinformation can actually create the lack of trust that these people have on the institutions of journalism. We need to show people that there are a lot of channels where you can have safe information, that you can trust what you're seeing, and that can also open the discussion for a safe competition, which is a project that the Congresswoman Jandira has, so we can fight what we see today with the monopolies that do create a barrier for the diversity of voices and diversity of narratives that are dominated by few people. So we need to see this plurality and this variety of voices so we can have a good democracy that can be sustained and that can be really created in a safe competition. There's also the reglementation that we're trying to create a sustainable business model so we can guarantee an economic environment that will create a safe space for journalism. So these are a few of the discussions that we are having here in the Congress. For example, this project that talks about the reglementation of journalism in different platforms. So we see that all these projects already exist, but we cannot reach the approval of these projects here because it is urgent that we don't fall in the lobby of the big techs, we don't fall for the lobby of some parties that promote themselves politically with fake news. And for that, our challenge is to win public opinion and to see the society having knowledge of all of that. And of course, having the support of other congressmen. For example, one of these projects, the 2630, it would be defeated in the Congress. So that is one of our challenges here in the Congress. And as a person who is really debating this theme constantly and who understands the urgency of what we're living, I would like to leave the message of the need of promoting democratic values, because we see people talk a lot about democracy, but they don't see the democratic values. They don't look at them as a part of society and how communication is part of that, and it's part of this promotion that needs to be projected and created with access to safe information so it can contribute to the formation of an informed and participant society, but informed with actual knowledge, with ethics and responsibility to the truth. Thank you, Congresswoman. We're going to do now our first international connection here in the seminar. We're going to talk about to the media historian Paul Matsko. Paul, thank you for your participation.
Thank you for the privilege of speaking with you today. So every country is confronting the decline of the traditional news industry, especially local news. But in the rush to do something, anything about that decline, policymakers in Australia, Canada, and now America have latched onto a very bad policy idea, what's called the link tax. The idea is simple. Since the internet undermined the advertising-dependent financial model of newspapers, then surely it's fair to ask big tech companies to spread around a little of the digital advertising wealth. So whenever Google or Facebook or another big platform shares a link to a news article, they should have to compensate the news publisher for doing so. Or at least that's what link tax advocates say. But it's a terrible policy idea for three core reasons. One, it misdiagnoses the problem. The primary source of newspaper revenue in the old days, in the pre-digital days, wasn't display ads, it was classified ads. News Corp founder Rupert Murdoch, most famous newspaperman in the world, once called classified ads rivers of gold. What destroyed newspapers wasn't competition for display ads from the likes of Google and Meta, but the competition for classified ads. And that was the fault of companies like Craigslist and eBay and others. Most of those savings actually went back to consumers who can now buy, find, list stuff for a fraction of what it once cost them. Now, you can't claw that money back, or probably should you. People like costless classifieds. So instead, a link tax goes after those with deep pockets, display ad focused companies like Google and Meta. But that only compounds the error. And that's because news producers and news aggregators aren't actually in an adversarial relationship. They're complementary services. How so? Well, those of us who are a bit older might remember that in the pre-digital days, the single largest category of expense wasn't paying journalists or printing newspapers. It was distribution, actually getting your news in front of eyeballs via newsboys, newsstands, and so on. But today, Google and Meta and similar platforms perform that service costlessly, more efficiently, and globally. That also means that if we force a choice, we may find out that news producers, newspapers, news outlets, need Google and Meta more than Google and Meta need the news. And that's why there's dire news coming out of Canada. I think Michael might be able to speak to this soon. Now that Google News has pulled out of Canada in response to its new link tax, some outlets are reporting up to 60% declines in web traffic. And that was entirely predictable. When Spain passed the link snippet tax, they called it, in 2014, and Google News pulled out of Spain, all 84 major Spanish newspapers lost significant traffic. So in the worst case scenario, a link tax simply leaves everyone worse off: news producers, news aggregators, and consumers. But the second reason a link tax is a terrible idea is that it's harmful even when it works, right? When it goes according to plan, even when Google and Meta don't pull out. That's because the normal mechanism of a link tax is a system of mandatory bargaining between news producers and news aggregators. But that system rewards heft. It gives an advantage to the large news conglomerates that are easier to bargain with. And so they can make more noise. They can make more political headaches if you cut them out of the bargaining process. But smaller, independent local news outlets struggle to shoulder in at the link tax trough. What happens next is that the big conglomerates, the big syndicates, are suddenly flush with a sudden, though maybe temporary, link tax windfall. So the three largest syndicates in Australia, including Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, came away with $200 million Aussie. And they started hiring journalists, but away from these smaller news outlets. And sometimes they just acquired those news outlets altogether. And that means the link tax regime tends to cause hyper consolidation of the news industry, which is great if you're one of the big papers, not so good if you're one of the smaller independent ones. It ends up being a wealth transfer from big tech to big ink. And we have proof of that from Down Under in Australia, which enacted its link tax in 2021. So since the link tax, nearly twice as many Australian news outlets have shuttered, merged, or contracted as have opened or expanded. And that rate of closures has actually accelerated in the last year. So it's not just a pandemic era phenomenon. Now, in the US, a link tax would primarily benefit the big hedge funds, which own more than half of daily newspapers. But that won't, again, actually help these small, struggling local newspapers that need the most help. So if your goal for a link tax is to boost hedge fund returns for the next few years, then by all means, back a link tax. If your goal is to help the local news industry, you should think twice. But the worst long-term effect of a link tax could be how it contributes to the breaking up of the World Wide Web. So think for a second, what is the web? It's just links, billions upon billions of hyperlinks that costlessly and frictionlessly connect websites together. That's the key. That's the web. Costless and frictionless linking. But a link tax says not so fast. For this category of websites, what we call news, linking is going to now be costly and frictionful, which is why the father of the modern web, the modern hyperlink, I should say, Timothy Berners-Lee, has come out against link taxes. He gets that it challenges the fundamental structure of the World Wide Web. To use older language, this is an act of digital enclosure, fencing off something that was once in the public domain, in the commons, and turning it into a new quasi-property right that exists for the benefit of a class of news outlet landlords and which operates at the expense of the commoners, the consumer. But when you add cost and inconvenience to a good or service, you end up getting less of that thing. And so to understand how both, radical and terrible this approach is, apply it to meat space, apply it to real life. Imagine if, because we felt bad for book authors, we created a new intellectual property right over not just the content of a book, but over the right to even share its title or to show its cover. So in this hypothetical system, if a library or bookstore merely wanted to list the book in its catalog or display it on its shelves, it would have to get express permission to do so and pay for the privilege. What do you think would happen? Well, obviously, fewer books would be sold or checked out. The time and expense of compliance, the friction and the cost would force bookstores and libraries to pare down their offerings dramatically. It would mean fewer books from fewer authors reaching fewer consumers, and that would be a disaster. And that's what would happen if we allowed the creation of a new quasi-property right over hyperlinks, the mere location of content, to news websites. So if a link tax is a bad idea, what do we do instead? We can talk about this more with questions, but look to the grassroots. There is evidence of a new news media, as I call it, sprouting up all around us. And that has the potential to not just substitute for traditional news gathering models, but to surpass them, because knowledge and expertise are distributed, scattered, and decentralized. New technologies, new platforms are enabling more of that scattered local knowledge, which is useful for telling about current events, to bubble up to the public consciousness, to become news. Again, we can talk about more of that in questions, but otherwise, thank you for your time.
Obrigado, Paul. Já
Thank you,
voltaremos
Paul.
com você.
We will be back to you in a bit.
Muito obrigado
Well, Carla e Gigi, thank you so much for being here. So, AJO, the Association of Digital Journalism, unites over 130 native digital organizations. And I wanted to know the view of AJO for the possible paths to strengthen these communication vehicles and what experiences have been seen as promising.
Resolver aqui o PowerPoint. Acho que precisa só colocar o PowerPoint aqui para mim. Enquanto isso, eu vou me apresentando e apresentando a AJO.
I'm setting up the PowerPoint and I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, about AJO. Well, we represent over 130 organizations for journalism, and it's important to see that
organizações que são lideradas
we
por
are organizations that are non-profit and profitable organizations. We have organizations focused on gender, focused on race, and I think it's important for us to see that when we're talking about a complex problem, we're also talking about complex solutions. I wanted to point out that local journalism here is another point that should also be brought here. But first, I want to point out that when we're talking about journalism, we're also talking about guaranteeing rights, not only individual rights, but also collective ones. So as the Secretary João Brandt said before, talking about vaccination, talking about schools, well, financing journalism is also looking at guaranteeing rights such as these for the entire population. So it's important to look at journalism also in a public perspective, not only the private one, because we see the sustainability of journalism sometimes as just a problem in the public sector, in the private sector, a market problem, but it's a problem for the whole society. And it's something that is happening around the world, something that we need to look at the reality of it. So as I said, we need to look at it by the public view. And here you have different choices for financing. And I see that the different platforms are what is being discussed the most right now. But we see that the choice between funding, public funding and private funding, it's not really an excluding choice. It's something that it could be a complementary solution. I'm going to try to be quick here because there's a lot of points. But when we talk about public funding, here in Brazil, we don't have public funding, and FENAGE has a proposal for that, and I think we should discuss it. But I want to bring a few points that we need to think about when we talk about public. Because the public funding should focus on public journalism, the one that is related to the guarantee of rights to what is effective for public rights. And of course, talking about public funding, we need to talk about the managing of it. Of course, journalists, they need to participate in that. The organizations, they need to participate in that. And it's important also obviously, for the government to overlook this management and see how it could be best done. Another important thing is that when you talk about public funding, is that we need to talk about the news deserts that were discussed in the last table, so I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I brought a few international examples that combine different strategies of different mechanisms that will overlook a more broad acting. Here, the innovation in journalism, we see that it's not only the innovation of a focused sector. You need to see the innovation of products, of processes, of business models to really talk about innovation of. So we need to think about how can the government finance projects that can actually promote the innovation of journalism. How can we think about support related to equipment, software, formation of these journalists, and of course, all of these things are points to be discussed. Here, when we talk about institutional media, how are we going to think about the investment in the institutional media as something that will bring the information from the government in an effective way? Is it something that we only need to think about how many people are getting the information, or should we also look at who getting the information? Because such a profile is being seen by people who have the choice to see it. How does it talk to the schools? How does it talk to education? We need to think about the segmentation of the public as it's an interesting discussion to be here. And well, just a comment here today. We can't finance a podcast, for example, because all of us here listen to journalistic podcasts every day. And this is an area that is being overlooked in general. We can also talk about the diversity of languages, because if we want to talk about, for example, investments in media vehicles that speak Spanish, we need to talk about the ethnical question, the racial question, the focus on the needs of each community. And then here we get to the point of funding by the digital platforms. I wanted here to bring Canada as an example, not only because of what has been decided, but also because of the public politics that have been adopted here. Trying to talk a little bit about what was already said, we need to think about why do we need to give with access, with distribution, but do the platforms actually profit from this journalistic content and credibility and access and search? I think that's something that we need to talk about. Is it a win-win situation? I think that we do win, but also the platforms win. So I also want to bring, well, there are 10 principles for this idea, but I'm only going to talk about the last one. This is a document created from a meeting in South Africa that brings a few worries and transparency, dependency, and a few other questions. And the last point is the result. So when we talk about public financing, we need to talk about the results of this financing, just as we do when we talk about the private ones. And we need to see the results on the media vehicles that already exist. How can we bring diversity? How do we not concentrate media? How can we create initiatives that will look at all these things? Well, I will finish here because I think I'm overdone with my time. Thank you so much. We're going to talk right now again with our international connection with the Professor Michael Geist from Canada. Professor, good morning. Thank you so much for participating. Carla did talk about Canada as an example of a country that has public and private policies to help journalism.
Okay.
And
Th-
that
Thank you for
is
that. Sorry, I
something.
was just waiting, I think, for the translation to conclude, but I think that I'm ready to go. So thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak. It's quite cold here in Canada, so I would be much happier if I was with you, but nevertheless, glad that we have the technology that allows me to participate. So Canada has been mentioned now on at least a couple of occasions. So it's really nice to have the chance to talk a bit about what Canada has been going through. And in fact, I've been asked on a number of occasions over the last number of months, and especially over the last week or so, as there's been some important new developments about how other countries will regard what we've experienced here. And I would suggest that it's a bit of a cautionary tale where we've experienced and continue to experience some of the risks and consequences of the particular government approach that we saw. And we had Paul made reference to some of the linking issues. I'm going to sort of expand a little bit, talk a bit more about some of the things that we've seen take place here in Canada in my few minutes. So I should start by noting, I think that, obviously countries around the world, and we've been hearing it right now in the situation in Brazil, countries right now are grappling with what is a very real issue, the challenge of conventional media very often struggling in the digital environment, new competition, shift in digital ad spending, a whole range of different, more choice, more competition, whole range of different issues. And I think it is well recognized that a viable, strong, sustainable, independent press is essential. And so then the question then becomes, how do you best achieve that? I would say that in Canada, initially, our current government, Liberal government led by Justin Trudeau, was quite reluctant to have the government get directly involved. I think for good reason. Concerns about what it would mean to have government directly fund or get engaged in the press raises, I think, fundamental questions about the independence of that press. But as the situation became more and more concerning, and as frankly lobbying from many media organizations ramped up, the government began, I think, to dip its toe in the water, began to say, okay, what can we do? It started first with a funding mechanism called the Local Journalism Initiative, where what it simply did was say, we will fund not journalism organizations, but rather journalism, and created the fund, essentially a granting program to allow for the hiring of particular journalists in different communities. And interestingly, the results of that work would be Creative Commons licensed. They would be openly licensed. The goal was to have this reporting take place, make it available, and then broadly disseminate it as much as possible. The next step, because that might have been helpful, but organizations continue to ask for more, was more government assistance. And in this instance, it came through a tax credit system to help pay for the costs of journalists. So we have a tax credit that covers the costs of journalists for what are known as Qualified Canadian Journalism Organizations, QCJOs. And these largely are print and some digital publications. They are not broadcasters. And initially, and I'll make reference to a recent change, the government said they would cover up to 25% of the costs of those journalists. And they created a cap on how much the salary of those journalists could be. Effectively, it was about 14,000 Canadian dollars per journalist as a tax credit. It's worth hundreds of millions of dollars and seen as very valuable. But then that too wasn't enough. And we started to see the organizations lobby for payments from the large internet platforms, and in particular Meta and Google, in fact, exclusively Meta and Google. And the model, as you've already heard, is the Australian model, the idea that the government would come in, force the platforms and the news media companies to negotiate some sort of deal. And the premise was largely based on the notion that they were linking to their content, not republishing it, but simply linking to it, and that there was some compensation necessary. At times, they talked about this as being theft of news. Other times, they simply talked about what was perceived to be an unfair bargaining situation. But regardless, that was the Australian model. Canada sought to match it, which led to legislation that we have. It is now passed as law, called the Online News Act. It is sometimes referred to as Bill C-18. And I mean, the bare bones of it is quite similar to Australia. The idea was that the government would identify large internet platforms that would be subject to this law, and it only applies to well, at the moment it only may apply to Google, but in theory the only two companies that would qualify would be Meta and Google. They would qualify so long as they linked to news. In the parlance of the legislation, as long as they facilitated access to the news, which would largely involve linking. On the other side, they said that they would have to negotiate with eligible news businesses, which was seen to be really any news outlet in Canada, practically. So not just print and digital, but also radio and television and the like. So so that's what that would be. They would negotiate these deals. If they were unable to negotiate the deals, it would go to a final offer arbitration system. And that's kind of the model that was in place. Our broadcast regulator, the CRTC, was charged with overseeing that system, and then deciding whether or not the deals themselves were sufficient. The response of the two platforms, really from day one, was that they objected to this legislation, and that not that they objected to helping to support journalism. And in fact, both companies had deals with many journalism organizations worth tens of millions of dollars, but rather they objected to that payments of links and that system of mandated negotiation leading to final offer arbitration. Meta, and I'll deal with both companies quickly, Meta's position was they simply would not pay for this, that in fact, they didn't post the news themselves. They didn't post full text of the articles. It was the users, often publishers themselves, posting. They were driving traffic back to those publishers, giving them real value. And so their position was, if it was a requirement to pay for links, they would simply stop linking. That is now, in fact, exactly what they've done. And so in Canada, we have not had news on either Facebook or Instagram since the end of July, early August. It's been for many months. People have suggested it was a bluff. It is clearly not a bluff. And faced with the prospect of either pay for links or exit news in Canada, they've made the decision to exit news in Canada. This has caused significant harm to many Canadian news publishers who were dependent on that traffic. And so that's the situation on Meta. In the case of, and I should note, the government clearly objected. They actually stopped advertising on Meta as a government, although the political party, the government, the Liberal Party, continues to advertise. And there's been attempts to launch some sort of boycott, but they haven't been very successful. Google similarly objected, but was always more open to payment. And in part, I think that is because they valued news somewhat differently. They would actually, of course, index the news, and the value, not so much in the Google News service, but rather in as part of search, was clear. And so they always, I think, made it clear that they were open to some discussions, though had similar concerns around mandated payments for links. Now, the law was scheduled to take effect in less than 2 weeks is scheduled to take effect in less than 2 weeks on December 19th. And there was no resolution between the government and Google. The government had published some regulations designed to implement this legislation. Google had identified many concerns. And in fact, we began to see even the media companies begin to say that they shared some of the same kinds of concerns, or at least understood where Google's concerns were coming from, and were receptive to some changes. And so just last week, the government did in fact announce a deal with Google. That deal involves Google being open to paying $100 million, Canadian dollars, to the media companies. The media companies will themselves decide how that gets allocated. About 3/4 of it is expected to go to broadcasters. So let me say, because I only have about a minute, let me just quickly say that while the government has tried to paint this as a win, I think the cautionary tale here comes from the reality that many news outlets are actually ending up losing money on all of this. Let's leave aside the losses from Meta having exited the market, those lost deals and those lost links. Even in the case of Google, they already had deals that were worth, as I say, tens of millions of dollars. We don't know the precise amount, but we know it is in that range. all of those deals will be folded into the 100 million. So it isn't 100 million in new dollars. It's probably about half that in terms of new dollars. And since 3/4 of that goes to broadcasters, including the public broadcaster, the reality is that many of the news outlets that were designed to be supported in this print, the major print publishers, are very likely receiving less money coming out of this legislation than more. The other quick thing to recognize here, and then with this I will conclude, I know I'm being asked to wrap up, is that Google had said from day one that is they were open to essentially a fund model, to putting in some money in support of journalism, as long as they knew what that was in advance. That's effectively where we've ended up. So that the government has now effectively created a fund where they will put in this 100 million. It will be governed by a yet to be developed collective in Canada. We're not quite sure how that will work, but that's really the model. And in the regulations that we will see in about a week, I'm reliably told that there will be a removal of the, or include a reference to say that this is not about payments for links, but rather about generally support for journalism. So some might say there is some success here. There is some amount of new money to be clear, but in the aggregate, I think it's pretty much a cautionary tale for many of the harms that the Canadian approach has created. And I'll stop there.
Obrigado, professor. Bom,
Thank you, Professor. Well, do you have any questions here? Anybody? Well, we're going to keep going here then. Well, Carla. Oh, wait, we do have a question. My name is Angela Heng, and I would like to listen a little bit about the possibilities, the positive of the proposals that were talked about in Australia and Canada, and any way that this could be applied to the Brazilian market. Well, I think we could ask that to the Professor Michael Geist and Paul Matsko. I think they could talk a little bit about this international experience, and then I would like to hear a little bit from Carla. I just ask you to be brief because our time is really running. Oh, Carla, of course. I would like to ask a question to the professors and to the Congresswoman. I think when we talk about the journalistic content that have already been produced, we need to talk about transparency. How can we evaluate if 100 million Canadian dollars does actually represent more money? Because here in Brazil, we can't really evaluate that. And it's actually interesting to think about what is the parallel to the Brazilian market relating to the amount of vehicles, amount of content produced, and the economic point of view. What does this represent for the platforms? Because the Canadian case is very individualized to Google, but when we're talking about Brazil, we need to talk about what can become, I think. So I wanted to ask, if we don't have transparency, how do we evaluate that in the financial point of view? Because we don't see, for example, in Australia, an exact amount of how much came in, and what is the actual impact and the resources, the transparency, I think. And the second point is, how do we guarantee diversity? Because yes, maybe there are a few organizations that now have contracts with specific platforms that could end up profiting less. So I wanted to ask these two things. Well, thank you, Carla. I think these two questions have a dialogue with themselves. I wanted to ask first Paul a little bit what are the points in the legislations both in Australia and in Canada that can also be positive here in Brazil, and also this issue of transparency that Carlos was talking about.
Yeah, great questions and really important points about the value of transparency and diversity. I do think, in as much as Canada is a cautionary tale, so too is Australia. And part of that is that the design of the link tax system there was a black box, right? You can't see in, you can't see out. The process is very opaque. And because of that, because the way the mandatory bargaining process was designed, it's all just kind of hearsay, the total amounts that were negotiated. Whether or not any particular deal leads to financing, who tried to get a bargain, who tried to get a deal made and was excluded from the process, all of that is opaque. And that's a real issue. And in what that opacity, a lack of transparency, it helps incumbents, it helps the big players, it helps the conglomerates and syndicates, and opacity hurts small, local, indigenous owned papers. The other thing to be worried about too, in both Canada and Australia, is that those downside consequences fall most heavily on smaller, local, and yes, indigenous owned outlets or indigenous serving outlets. That's been true in Australia, and there is some buzz that that's going to be true in Canada as well. So those are important considerations. I think, if you really want transparency and you want something that serves the interests of diverse ownership and diverse audiences, then rather than relying on a link tax, you should instead bypass that whole process and move directly. I don't necessarily favor this as a policy, but it is preferable to a link tax is some sort of direct funding model where, in partnership with Google or taxpayer finance, rather than this behind closed doors deal-making process that favors incumbents and decreases accountability, decreases transparency, and decreases diversity.
Obrigado, Paul. Agora vamos ouvir o professor Michael.
Thank you, Paul.
Sure,
now
thanks.
I'd like to hear Michael.
Great, thank you. So I'll just say a couple of things. First, on the sort of what we might take out positively or might take out from Canada, just to reiterate, I think one of the real lessons here is that the value of news on the platforms, from a pure economic perspective, can be in many instances quite limited. When Facebook or Meta insisted that, in fact, news isn't worth a lot to them, I think many in the Canadian media didn't think that was possible because it was so important to the media companies for that referral traffic. But Meta's experience now for many months has been that there has been no decline in usage or activity on their platform. And some of their metrics suggest that, in fact, people are happier on the platform without some of the news that's there, which I think is a sad commentary, but it simply is where things are at. They have found it's highly substitutable. People spend the same amount of time on the platform looking at pictures of friends or memes as they do reading news links. In fact, news links is viewed as bad content in the sense that it sends the user off the platform. So I think that governments, when they think about this legislation, need to recognize that the pure economic motivation of some of the platforms is not to include news. And there is great value, especially to some of the smaller players. I have a podcast and spoke to one of the largest independent owners of media in Canada this week. And he noted he has not expanded into any new markets since this law took effect, because without Facebook, which is his number one way to develop a new community, he's not really able to follow through on what his business model has been. So there are a lot of risks here that I think need to be accounted for. On the issue quickly of transparency, I think you raise an excellent point. And the Canadian government had tried to argue that our law is more transparent. But I don't know that it really is that much more transparent. We know the whole number now that Google will be paying into, as I say, what amounts to a fund. But we don't yet this stage know precisely how it's allocated, nor did we know, to be fair, how much was or is being spent right now. So transparency is unquestionably one of the real problems that we face here. My own view in terms of how to move forward, a fund model is sort of a next best. It's better than what we had. I think, frankly, the best approach is to tax companies appropriately, whether that's through a digital services tax or otherwise, to ensure that they are making a fair contribution into the country. And then it falls to government to establish appropriate mechanisms to deal with it, whether that is through tax credits for journalists or indirect funding in the sense of setting up funds that are then administered by others that help fund journalism. But I think that we have to be very conscious that in our effort to support independent media and independence of the press more broadly, that we don't lose some of the very goals that we have with solutions that actually may undermine some of that independence.
Muito obrigado, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Well, Congresswoman Carol da Tora, how do you see these points that are being discussed? There are such 4 points in the legislation of Canada and Australia. How does the Congress see that? And we're asking if in this mandate, do you think there's any that can already be done? What are the paths? I also ask you to be brief, and thank you. Well, firstly, the advance for us has to go through regulation because this field is still completely open right now. So the first thing is that we can regulate with the projects that are already here, and to see how we can do this remuneration and how can we advance, of course, always looking at the other countries that already had more advanced than us. I would like to bring a view that is more specialized than mine from the Federation of Journalists, and that is discussing a letter in the Congress that I think is very important. So they point out that these rules to strengthen the regulation of medias of different types without, of course, overlooking accords with big tech media, and how that can be done in a way that will reach the professionals that are related to the production of these contents, and how the sharing of these resources can be reinvested in the journalistic production and in the bettering of our conditions of work. I think our first challenge is the sensibilization of how important that is, the sensibilization, the understanding in the Congress and in the society in general, that is something that needs to be talked about, and letters such as these are a way for us to really disclose to everybody this discussion and see how all organizations can really take part in this conscience, that it's a discussion that cannot stay the way it is, which is a discussion that never gets to its goal. So the first thing is to really make the Brazilian Congress understand how important this discussion is, see advances, because they are very important for the advance in our society. Thank you, Congresswoman. Well, we're finishing this table right now because we still have another discussion. Carla, please, you have a minute to do your final considerations. Thank you for being here, your contribution. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you for everybody watching. Time is always a hard thing to manage. I would just like to point out the complementarity, the idea that the sector of culture in Brazil is it's a good example of copyrights and public financing. I would also like to reinforce the issue in transparency because there is not a lot of transparency related to Canada and to Australia, as we were talking about. And something that our ideas are not losing in case of transparency, but they're just keeping what has been done. And actually, these ideas need to be bettered so we can actually bring them to the Congress and to actually become laws. And also, we need to understand why a few vehicles actually profit and why do they profit so much. And that falls into the transparency because we need to see how much is being offered to the big media vehicles and to the small ones, because it's very hard to negotiate without really knowing what's on the table. And I'd like to say to the Congresswoman that we're together in this fight, that this is something that needs to be talked about more in the Congress, that needs public policies that look into innovation, transparency, and diversity. Thank you, Carla. Professor Michael Geist, thank you for participating. Please, you have a minute for your final considerations.
Oh, sure. Thanks. And well, I just want to thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to come and speak. I know there is an urgency around these issues in countries around the world. There should be, because an independent, viable, strong press is critically important. But I urge you to look to what we experienced in Canada and go beyond what certainly lobby groups on all sides say, and go more deeply into what the actual impact is. Talk to the local press people, talk to individuals who now find some of their access cut off, not because of tactics, but because of a misread of the economics of the market and a decision to follow through on policies that I think were flawed early on when there were better alternatives available. So as I said off the top, I think Canada is in many ways a cautionary tale of some of the risks of moving ahead with a model that looks like it might be an appropriate solution, but carries with it some pretty significant risks.
Muito obrigado, professor. Esperamos
Thank you very much, Professor. We hope to have you here in Brazil soon. The Congresswoman Carol Bartola, thank you for your participation, and 1 minute for your final considerations. I would just like to thank you for the invitation to congratulate this discussion that is being done here. I feel that we are aligned in this fight, and as we were talking about, this is a global discussion, and Brazil has a lot of challenges in this specific point, and you can count on me in this fight. And that's all. Thank you, Congresswoman. And Paul Matsko, thank you so much for your participation as well. We also hope to have you here in Brazil soon. Please, your final considerations.
I'd like to add a positive note to end, which is, there's a lot of, I don't want to underplay how difficult the situation is for news outlets, but on the horizon, there's a lot of promising developments in what I call the new news media. Ben Thompson, technologist Ben Thompson, talks about sovereign writers, sovereign news creators. And if you look at folks experimenting with newsletters, YouTube commentators, TikTok creators, there are folks who are taking on the burden of producing news using hyper specialized knowledge, allowing consumers to craft their own package of news information about topics as diverse as the war on Ukraine to the, business dealings in Shenzhen, China, in a fine-grained level of detail. And we're starting to turn the corner. There are new results coming out of the US that for every traditional news outlet that closes down, there is a news startup, web-only news startup with a newsletter or a podcast and so on that's replacing it. So there is a really promising stuff on the future, and what we don't want to do is bail out shambling zombie-like traditional news entities while missing the promising kind of green shoots of the new news media in the process. So take heart. There's good stuff on the horizon. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Well, we had the requests in the first table. The first table talked about the news deserts and showed the work that they do in the census of these cities that don't have any communication vehicles. Here we have a QR code with the access to this research. Well, thank you very much for being here. And now we're going to have our third and last table. I would like to call Silvio Costa to keep going with their works. Thank you very much.
Alô? Problema. Alô? Bom, bom dia. Vamos para a terceira e última mesa. Então, eu quero chamar aqui, eu espero acertar a pronúncia do seu nome. Nina Vengrio, tá certo? Nina Vengrio, que é cofundadora do Nós, né, consultora na área de comunicação, por favor, Nina. A Silvia Fagade Almeida.
Silvia Fagassi, Director of LCA, Doctor in Economics from FGB, please. And Patricia Blanco, President of the Open World Institute. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. So we use the same mechanism as the previous tables. Each one has 10 minutes for a brief presentation. I will start, so I don't. I will start from right to left. So please, Patricia, you have the first word. Good morning for everyone. who are here and online. It's a pleasure to be here in this discussion, so important, so necessary. So, Silvio, thank you very much for the invitation. Speaking of paths for strong, sustainable journalism, I think goes through a fundamental question, which is taking back the importance and of journalism from the audience. When we see the last words of Michael in his participation, when people say that they are happier not having contact with news on Facebook, we have a problem. We have a serious problem. To me, is the fundamental problem, not only in vehicles and funding, financing or hiring of journalists, the value of professionals in media, since journalism or radio and communicators in general, but making the audience value and recognize good journalism. So we have seen throughout the years, when our collective started the work of media education, we follow from the advent of new technologies, what we called in 2013 the new era. It is new voices, new players in the market of ideas, that the distribution of new medias, new possibilities of interaction with communication, and from the other way, a complete rupture in the traditional business created by technology, but as Carla has mentioned, the lack of preparation for the digital from the news media, traditional news media. So we have a technical, operational problem from the vehicle, but we have a philosophical problem, which is bringing audience back. How can we do that? How can we make the citizens value information, journalistic information? News literacy, education, making the citizens recognize and differentiate content from an article and news or something that is an opinion that doesn't have the same authority or the same method. Recognizing good journalism or the journalism of who does that professionally, from the journalist who's an activist that places as a journalist. It's important to have the activists, but not being recognizable from as a journalist. I think we need to learn how to differentiate it. And what I see is that we need to value, train, and form critical audiences to value journalism, display the freedom of press, and the importance of press is not something that should only be defended by the journalist or the professional in media. It's something that needs to be defended by all citizens if we want to keep the democratic system that we live in. If we don't have that idea to create critical audience, we are only talking to the believers and diminishing the flow of financing, being from publicity that depends on audience or subscription devices or voluntary contributions from public financing, as some vehicles have adopted, but we need to bring this audience to our side. And from the side of the media, what I see is that we need to have transparency. The editorial model, we need vehicles that tell us what they came for. It is important that we have within the editorial principles the transparency, so the audience know how to identify and verify what that media outlet is actually talking. What is the editorial line they follow? So we need to change the idea that people know by themselves. We imaginate that people understand how journalism works, and we would value journalism, and that is not true. The news avoidance, not wanting contact with journalism and news, it is a reality data, and it has a tendency of expanding. We hear that people saying they don't listen to news and they don't read newspapers because news are disturbing. They bring information that they don't want. So they stop reading, they stop contributing, stop buying, and it affects something that we have been following, which is the growth of the violence against journalists and communicators. We had abuse and attacks virtually, trying to discredit journalists, especially women. So solutions and paths to that: media literacy and education, understanding what the goal of the journalist is, recognizing the journalism and journalists as fundamental for democracy, and fundamental to bring quality communication for the vehicles of communication. Is all. Thank you.
Now, Silvia, please. It's working here. I brought a quick presentation here, but first I would like to thank for the invitation, because I think this debate is very different from my day-to-day life. I'm actually an economist, and I work a lot of issues related to defense of free competition and of a lot of different economic markets. And I learned a lot in the other panels, but what I brought today here is a little bit of what was already said, but in an economic point of view, which is a bit colder than what we heard. We heard a lot of the human aspects as well. I want to point out that we also need the human point of view. Of course, it's so important. But as was said in the first panel, we talk about the positive points of view related to the journalism, because we see that a lot of people are giving up on it. So I brought here today in a very conceptual form, I believe, a few things related to the journalistic market that relate to the need of a public policy related to that. And it has a little bit of diagnostics of it, and also will bring to what can be done. So I need to say that the journalistic content that I am focused on is the idea that is the healthy journalism. So we don't get lost in what is journalism, what isn't. We are focusing on this concept of what is healthy journalism. We see that it's a public good, and not a public good as a light post, but a public good that it's important for the knowledge in society, because the competition here is different, because it's not excluded. The fact that a person has access and pays for access in one media outlet doesn't mean that they won't do it in another one. So if they get news in WhatsApp and Facebook and other medias, I'm actually disclosing this information to people who aren't paying for it. So if we put resources into these, what I would say, an invisible hand, we might not really see the market as allocating these resources in the best way. And beyond that, there is the idea of a positive impact, because the more informed the society is, the better democracy works. I think this was already clear from other speeches done here. So what we see is that we're worried that the public investment would bring a decrease in the private investment put into this market. And we see from the first panel that almost half of the cities don't have a local news outlet. That is an impact that is much below what we would hope and expect. Here, I brought the form of investment that is more traditional that we know, is the idea that the advertisement market, which is the one that we see right now, putting money into other contents that not all of them are of public interest. But we see that these investments actually are not really related to the public interest itself, because the advertisement market wouldn't, for example, be interested in talking about the difference in the changes in the dates of a public test. That's an example of what we see. And then in the end of it, you have the readers that bring the cross contents, some from public interest and some not. And that is, well, and that ends up being more related to content that is not of public interest. We see then that in this relationship between advertisers and users, you have the digital platforms such as Meta and, well, many others that will bring the content from one side to the other. So we see that this digitalization is a process that is going on in economy in general. It is a reality already. This is a graph with some data from IBGE, and we see that Brazil does go into an important position when it comes to the use of internet in general and the growth of this market. So in general, what I wanted to bring is the idea that you can see clearly that the digital media has been growing a lot, especially related to press, printed press, and that is not something that is going on only in Brazil. But another point that is being looked at is that in this, a lot of people have been only looking at social media, but in that, the consuming of content related to journalism has been decreasing. Maybe there's another way of disclosing this type of content that we don't know yet, but in general, if this search is not growing, maybe this indirect type of investment could come out of control. I am trying to be quick here, sorry. And Brazil is really intense if you compare the time spent in the internet is impressive. I mean, it's about 9 hours a day that the Brazilians spend. And also the use of smartphones is a big data in Brazil, because we see that people specifically have this dynamics when it comes to the use of social media. Here you have the difference that before you would only see news on TV or in the newspapers, but you see that it has been going around and spreading in many different ways. So we need to have the spread into the areas of financing as well, because if the printed press has been growing, then it's not that interesting to actually invest so much in it. And you cannot overlook all the ways that this investment needs to spread it. So we also have here the spread of journalists per inhabitants. We see that even the professionals are concentrated in a few areas, as well as the difference in generation. You see, of course, the formal employment, which is another question in precarization of work. But if you see, for example, the federal district or Rio or São Paulo, they have a remuneration that are on average 4 times bigger than in other places. And then you see the concentration of the allocation of formally employed journalists. You see, of course, that they are concentrated where there are the focuses on the big devices and the big media outlets. So you see that if the journalists aren't really spread, obviously the media outlets will also be concentrated. So we see here that digitalization has been creating a lot of changes, and it has been showing us the differences and the spread of investments and the needs for these investments. But of course, it also brings new opportunities with new vehicles of media being created and new openings and opportunities in such outlets, since you don't necessarily need the use of printed press to spread this type of information. But there is also the factor that is one of the factors that brings the difference and the disparity in remuneration. And of course, we need to talk about the mechanisms of investment and the precarization of the work, because if we don't have the journalists being well employed everywhere, you cannot have the market working everywhere. So the big challenge here is the diversity in the types of content, because it's really hard for a public investment to get in when you don't really have the division between what is a content of public interest and what is not, since it's complicated to put your money into something that you don't really know what's for. And of course, the disparity in localities and places where the public policies will actually work on, because we need to think about what agents are going to be the goal of impact of this public policy and how it is going to be reached. So talking about this is one of the ways that I think we can keep talking about this discussion that is so important. Thank you so much. Nina, please.
Hello, everyone. I have a bad place here between you and lunchtime. My name is Nina. I'm a journalist, and my experience thinking sustainable journalism starts in 2009. And the first business model from this organization I've co-founded was my car. I sold it and it hasn't even been paid yet, so it was a debt. Just to contextualize where my experience comes from, it's from this place of experimenting a lot of alternatives from 2009 to nowadays to finance journalism. After this experience, I've dived in to support this organization, creation of a network and local journalists in these deserts of news that we have been speaking about. In 2016, that I saw in your graph, there was a peak of growth in organizations. There was data mapping of independent media, and I was very curious. And there were a little more than 100 initiatives, and I started to categorize them. And we were in one of these. One of the answers is, one of the questions was, how do you found yourself? And I started to categorize, and I got to 14 different funding from this independent media from 2016 onwards. Looking at myself and what we do as an organization, and we had already tried the 14 different forms of funding. So just to say that diversity of funding is very vague. This is the answer, but in fact, it's what we've experienced since public politics for financing of culture. We've had experiences in that, or advertising content, formative processes that we collect. After the pandemic, we've nationalized the work of the organization to support the initiatives that couldn't find that funding, and it started to be available from international interests in Brazil. The funding that arrived for this kind of activity have grown. When we started, we didn't have any financing for these initiatives from 2009, but from 2020 onwards, it starts to happen in a more organized fashion, supporting these organizations, but understanding that there isn't one way out when we look at the the scenery of 50% of the city's philanthropy is not enough to fix that hole. So our experience is starting to understand that dynamic, and me personally have left the organization last year to dedicate myself to that. I started to study how can we think of public politics not in a federal scenario. It's important to discuss how we can look at mobilizing the resources, taxing platforms, etc. But there is a problem that the resources that we have available, they are not reaching the organizations that are not formally created. They are not formal companies. There are a number of barriers, including digitals, for these journalism to be produced in these territories. So I start looking at that from the point of view of my experience, which is a local living of these organizations that have been formed within their communities and to support these processes of distributing and producing information in a civil way. And now we need to discuss what is journalism of public interest. There's a reference I like to talk. We've studied the Maslow pyramid that talks about basic necessities. There's an American journalist that has mapped placing into that pyramid the type of journalism that has been produced in the US and what is the basis of that pyramid. The basic necessities are basic opportunities. What are the journalism that we receive that give these basic necessities? And now I make a provocation that goes beyond who can reach those basic necessities. That is not journalism, it's the organization within the neighborhoods, the transparency agencies. So my contribution is so we can talk about ecosystems. Let's look at the ecosystem. How can we support the ecosystem? Create mechanisms to support this ecosystem. And the ecosystem, when we look in the nature, is not made of one thing. We can't talk about the journalism ecosystem isolated from all of the other organizations and actors and agents that work to produce and disseminate information of basic necessities and public interests in the territories, sometimes a lot more than journalism, because as we have seen, we don't have journalists. So when we think about the future, we can't ignore the scenery. The ecosystem is a lot more complex than we can see. And we can think in solutions. And I will create an exercise of imagination, radical imagination here. How can we think beyond? I participate in events in congresses, and we keep circulating discussions that we should have settled. Activism, journalism, who creates real journalism? I think we need to give steps forward. I think it is radical imagination to think from that optics, but coming from where I come with the experience that I have, I can't think of journalism separated from all of the other issues, the challenges that are placed. And we can't isolate from, as journalists within that context, and think about media literacy. I like to create that provocation. How do we remove media from the central? Media is important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't care for it, but it is very relevant, but how we work it as one of the actors of the information ecosystem. And from that look of removing the media from the central, how can we create new paths, especially from public politics? We have experiences, and I've been mapping it for 2 years, of funding to community media, radio in states, in cities. They are few, and we have a problem of continuity, but they exist. In 2014, there was legislation in a state that defines 20% of the funding. Publicity funding of the state was exclusively to community media, and that has allowed a network of 200 community radios in the state. There are experiences that can inform and create new proposals, but we need to discuss that from a different point of view. And we need to push the sky a little bit further so it doesn't fall on our head, as says Ailton Krenak. Thank you.
Well, we're almost finishing here. Our time is not long, but I think there is a fundamental question to talk about here. It's the solutions, right? I love this idea of solutions because journalists usually come up with the problems, but last year we had a series of debates of Congresso and Foco, and the idea was not to leave with a lot of questions, but at least a few answers. And I'd like to ask these professionals who are here and have such an interesting and diverse experience in the field, I would like to ask a question from, well, that was already discussed in the last panel, is the discussion of how much, right? In Canada was 100 million Canadian dollars. That was the accord with Google from last week. And in Australia, I think it was 100 million American dollars. But it's not only the question of how much. First, we need to talk about how to create the idea of how dimensions the needs of these people and how can we help with these problems. Well, thank you for this question. I think I see these problems as an economist as well. And well, it's not an easy answer to give. The idea, as I said, and how do we finance the solution? We need to see what is the problem. We need to see what type of content is the content of public interest, because this definition is already a bit flawed. We need to see what is this type of content, because the people who are going to get this type of support are the people who are producing this specific type of content. And then we see what do they need to produce this content. And especially because this is the type of content that probably wouldn't get a lot of profit in other ways, so we really need the public financing to do that. And in the way to see where to destine this funding, it's a study that the government will have to do, that to see, for example, if they decide that the digital platforms are the ones that are going to be interested as economic agents that generate this journalistic content. So we need to see first, what is the content that will be subsidized? Who is producing this content, then how much we would need, and then the government can create devices on how to tax or how to get this amount needed. So I would go through this order so we can know how much we should invest, because you can't see how much if you don't know to whom and how much they need. I would also like to ask Patricia now, because she presented a path of education, because the path of education always has a lot to offer. However, we see that despite what the great work that you have doing, it is a very underdeveloped content in the discussion, because you see, for example, even from preschool in other places, children already have access to websites and to understanding how these medias work. And here in Brazil, it's not a reality, at least not for people who are not, very privileged. So I would like to ask, how can we think again on the type of material that we are producing? And also, how can we bring the understanding to people so they can not fall in this type of fake news? Because we really understand how the production of media and news is made, but we need to really make people understand how they can see what's what. Well, I'd like to thank you for this question, because I'd like to talk about solutions. And of course, there is not one path to bring back the audience to journalism. Education is one of them, and the right financing of this journalism is the right path, and there's a lot of different paths. But talking a little bit about the education related to journalism, we have been working in a program of capacitation of teachers, and it's a program that in the few years that we have been doing it has already impacted over 50,000 teachers. We see today with that there is the need and there is the interest for mediatic education here in Brazil. So we see that right now the mediatic education has a view that is not as considered as it should, because in our curricular basis from 2019, there is a space, a very clear space for mediatic education inside the Portuguese language education, because in there is the mediatic ideas in which the students should be learning on all how to see fake news, how to deal with websites. So that is in the basis. And also in the preschool basis, there's at least 5 fields in which you can put mediatic educations in human sciences and technologies. You can talk about it in geography. You can talk about it in many opportunities. But our big challenge right now is actually the capacitation of teachers, because what we have today is teachers who, well, they don't like to be called heroes, but in general, they are, because they don't have the right devices, they don't have good prospects for a career, and if we offer them a problem, we offer them the idea, now you need to talk about digital citizenship, you need to talk about media, you need to talk to, and this teacher, sometimes they don't really know about it, they are a stranger to this subject, and now they have this huge problem and they have to deal with. So when we started this, is the idea that the first public that needs to be educated is not the students, actually the teacher. So we changed our program so we could give the teacher the opportunity to give a good idea of what is going on and how to assess the information. Because the teachers that we had in our program couldn't really see what is a real journalism. So right now, inside our Congress and our government, we have the basis, but we need the opening to really grow into the capacitation and the formation of this type of education. Well, thank you. Well, you see how complex this is, right? Nina, you're going to be the last one. And I would like to ask you, as a founder of Enois,
I recommend,
and I would like to invite everybody to learn more about them. And as also a researcher, I would like to ask, what does a journalistic organization, and well, we're going to talk about what is of public interest here. What does this organization need, and how they can be helped to produce such types of contents? Is it money? Is it education? And how can the economic and institutional organizations help, including the Congress, Google, who, well, for transparency, we know it's sponsoring, can do?
oh my God, I will try. I will not say that I have the solution for all the problems. We are here in 3 tables trying to talk about that. If I could add anything beyond what has been said here, we need qualification. I was speaking earlier today about the necessity of formation of editors. The people that do that today haven't had the experience of going through forming in that sense. And things that are still invisible as how it constructs structurally. If I could say something that we need to look for is the community. These organizations need the support of their communities for the construction so that they can support themselves within these spaces, but from readers. And I'm not talking about local news, but journalism as a whole. We need to create these communities. There is an interesting data that was created by SIG of the financing of social organizations, not only on journalism, that says that from all the interviewed, the amount financed by people donating directly to these organizations is up to 63%. while the financing of companies is 22%. When we look at journalism, that number is 10% of people who finance journalism. So we go back to the conversation on public interest. Why do these people think it's more interesting to donate to causes and they don't understand that journalism also has that role? Where are we making mistakes that we can take these audiences back and defending their interests? And this is why it's your interest that these organization, this structure exists. And how can you contribute to this financially or not? I think if we look from that perspective, that is more complex and involves many other actors, we can then dialogue with philanthropy. We are living in strangulation of this financing because the country is not threatened democratically anymore. So the money from philanthropy migrates for countries where the emergency is higher. So we have that critical way of how can that money come back here. And the same thing with the platforms. There is a dispute of power of how these accords are designed, how these mechanisms of that can create the money to circulate. And I go back to thinking of the ecosystem that is more complex and that involves people in the process and in the financing of this journalism, so we can create a work that is independent of and from public service. I think I've replied very well, Nina. I think it was a good challenge. When I was here in the first table, we were 3 men and 1 woman, and a friend just said, "Oh, this is not good." But now we end. Well, but Katia is great. So I hope that she is still here and to see that we've respected diversity with this table of high quality. Everything that we had here will be available in social media. We'll still publish a lot. I hope to have the presentations so that people can have access to the presentations that were made here today. The new research that was presented by Sergio. This work of high value presented by Sylvia, and I thank you who has followed. I thank all the participants on the table. Thank you to Marcelo Zaga, our operations director. He has worked a lot. São Sardinha, director of communication, all of the crew involved. Thank you, Google, for the support, and I hope we are contributing and will continue contributing because this theme is in the Congress. If something is approved next semester, I don't know, but anyway, we will continue following the subject, and thank you very much. Good day, good afternoon. Thank you.
Every move you make, every bound you break, every step you take, I'll be watching you.